All right. Well, hey, good morning. Welcome to church. My name is Marc at the pastor of our church, and it's a great privilege, fun thing that I get to do. Bless you, by the way. So, it is a good thing to do. Some of you know this, some of you don't know this. I teach high school, and this was fall break. So, Thursday, Friday, we were out. We didn't do anything, and so we just got to sleep in. It was great, and then tomorrow will happen, right? So, and you know this, some of you, like if you come off vacation, you're like, oh, the next day is going to be brutal, right? So it'll probably be a quiet reading day in my classroom. So self-led, how about that? So there we go. But in this week, we're in week 2 of Kingdom Treasure, and it's one of this great thing that Jesus has been doing. He's going to start telling parables, small little stories, and they have great, deep meaning. And sometimes they solve things for you, questions you may have, and a lot of times they're going to ask or like raise up more questions for you. You may settle some things and be like, oh wait, what about this? And that's the point of it, right? And so it's part of this process that Jesus has been doing. Now, towards the end of his ministry, Jesus is going to start ramping up the parables, these small little stories of how he expects his people to wait and how to wait well. You can wait prepared, or you can wait unprepared, and they'll have consequences and ramifications and rewards if you're prepared, right? And so as he's doing this, he's going to like tell these parables, and then he's going to leave. He's going to go to heaven. And now we have to ask ourselves, what are we getting prepared for? And the preparation is like when Jesus arrives, are we actually going to be prepared for it? Are we going to be stuck? Are we going to be worrying about the things of this world and not prepared for his kingdom to be ushered in? And last week we talked about the kingdom of heaven is like this treasure that the guy finds in a field, and he sells everything that he has and he buys the field, which means that he has the treasure, right? And then it's probably going to be this thing where he sells the treasure because you can't live off of gold. Like you can't eat gold. You know what I mean? You can try it, I guess, but it'd be weird. I don't know how you're going to survive it, but try it and see what happens. Same thing with the pearl. So it's this idea that it's going to cost you something to invest into. Now, just clarification, it's not a way to earn your salvation. It just means that you can't enter the kingdom of heaven and stay the same. Like every sacrifice you make is going to end up worth it, right? The sins that you're going to stop doing is probably going to be worth it. Start living by his ethics and his kingdom manifesto and stuff like that is going to be worth it. But for you to think, well, I just prayed this prayer, I don't need to change my life, you're living unprepared. You're living in these hopes and dreams thinking, well, I went through all the motions and I said all the right things, and just going to be like, that's not at all what I was looking for, right? And he's continually thinking about how you and I can walk into this and have this understanding that it's well worth the cost and the investment for us to change. So, just a heads up for you today. Whenever I write a sermon, I think about 3 things. What I want you to think about, how do I want you to feel, because I care about your feelings, right? So I care about how you're going to walk out of here feeling something, and then the third thing is what I want you to do based on these sermons, right? Like I never want you to be like, well, that's cool, and have no action steps to it. Now, I'm not going to tell you what those action steps are, but I hope that you would have some action steps. Today's a little bit different, okay? I'm just going to tell you what I want you to think, what I want you to feel, and what I want you to do. Here are the things that I want you to think about. That there's nothing impossible with the kingdom of heaven. There's nothing impossible that God could not do, right? Number 2, the feeling. That you may feel like you're only one person, but what could your one person limited resources possibly do with the hands of God? You may not have a lot to offer. We don't. You know what I mean? Like none of us have a whole lot to offer, but could we actually do that and offer it to Jesus? And here's what I want you to do. I want you to offer your limited resources to God and watch him advance his kingdom through your effort in your life. And what it would look like for you to just simply do that. So, a few years ago, I was having lunch with one of my friends who lives up near Hammond, and we ate it at his favorite taco place. And I was like, you don't have to argue with me about that one. So I got my 3 tacos, sat down at the booth, and I noticed there were bins of vegetables, and a lot of people were eating the vegetables, and they didn't seem to have a whole lot of reaction. They were just like, yeah, that's cool. It's nice vegetables. So I was like, I'll try this. So I put some on my plate, started eating it, And my friend starts walking towards me. And I'm eating the vegetables going, oh, it's not that bad. And then all of a sudden it got really bad. And my friend starts laughing at me. And he just like went back to the counter, got me an horchata, and like a large one. And he just sat around. It was like a gallon size one. Have you noticed that? Like when you get a large, it's like, here's your gallon of this. Here's your like just pre-diabetic version of this. You know what I mean? And he starts laughing at me. And I'm like, what is going on? Like, he goes, a little goes a long way, right? And I was like, that would have been a nice warning. It's just like hot. You know what I mean? Like, you're going to die. You know, like all those things. Like, you might want to make sure your will's in place before you eat these. So I was like, what the crap? You know what I mean? And it's just a phrase that little goes a long way. And this is the reality of like, man, sometimes you and I step into places and we think we have to have these big, grand gestures. Here's the deal. A little goes a long way, right? So something that we think is going to be like this, like it doesn't feel like it's that big of a deal. It's not like it has no, like it may be insignificant to you, but it has a changing of everything for you, right? Years ago when I wanted to change my health habits, I wanted to change my diet. I wanted to change how I worked out and all that. And this small, stupid, like habit changed everything for me. I started flossing. Because when I flossed, I reminded myself, I want to be healthy. And when I flossed, then all of a sudden I would start to brush my teeth properly. And when I did that, then I put my workout clothes out. And all this, it was a small little thing that just didn't seem like it was that big of a deal. But it had all these chain of event type things that happen. And when it comes to the kingdom of heaven, there's these small little things that God's going to ask you to do, and you don't, like, why would I do this? And it may be not like that big of a deal, but he may be saying, hey, I've got something in store for you. Will you just trust me with these small little things, right? And so it has these major impacts. And we're going to look at a couple of different parables today. One is in Matthew, and I'll just read them for us so we can have it. But Jesus is going to start telling these parables. And he says this: the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man planted. He took and he planted in his field. And it's the smallest of the seeds, yet it grows to be the largest garden plants in the tree. Like it becomes a tree so the birds of the air can perch in its little branches. And then he tells another story, another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. It's like a batch of yeast that a woman took, and it's 60 pounds of flour, and she puts a little bit of yeast into it. It kneads. Now think about 60 pounds of flour. This is not like a small little batch, right? 60 pounds of flour is implying that's a massive feast that she's getting ready for. And so all of a sudden now that is there. And here's what this whole point of this is saying. Like they start asking, why do you teach everything in parables? And here's what Jesus says: I'm going to open my mouth in parables so that like everything I say will come out of this, and I'm going to utter the hidden things from the creation of this world. That these things have been hidden from creation of this world, and yet Jesus is like, yep, this is what I'm going to do. He starts teaching in parables. Once again, it starts clarifying some things, but scrambling questions that we have in other things. Because God has had something planned from the very beginning of this world for us to experience, right? Now, whenever we talk about like the kingdom of heaven and all this, like we always think, yeah, and let's be honest, there's going to be a financial talk in this talk, right? Like that's just part of this process. But every time I want you to understand this, that God has something for you, not something from you. You may think, man, it's a scarcity mindset. All you want is my money. And let's be honest. Like if you're here, you probably come from some kind of jaded, cynical church background. Join the club, right? So have I. And one thing that I always talked about was, man, churches always talk about money. We just try to limit it to once a year, so that you're like, if you're like new here, you're like, great. You just happen to talk on the one series that we're going to talk about money. Welcome to church. Don't know what to tell you. But here's the deal. Jesus talks way more about money than he does about heaven and hell. It's something near and dear to his heart. He knows it's near and dear to us. And so we always think about, oh, you just want something from me. And I would say, no, Jesus wants something for you. He wants you to experience something that is great. Now, let's talk about the mustard seed, okay? The mustard seed is unruly. It's not tameable. It is just this wild plant that breaks every barrier. Now, if a farmer everyone farmed in Jesus' day and age, and they would have these small plots of land, so they would have like a couple acreage and stuff like that, And the way that they actually lived, they didn't have a lot of grocery stores. They had markets and stuff like that. But for the most part, they would live off of what they grew. There's no government subsidies. There's no organizations that were relying on. And so if a farmer noticed that the field wasn't producing the crops that they thought, like in the pace that it should, right? And there's multiple harvests that they would take through. If they noticed the first harvest was a little low, the second harvest was like, crap, you know what I mean? They were like, hopefully we'll make it up. They would notice that the ground was a little overworked. And most of them had like 4 plots. And they would leave 1 plot empty if they were very Orthodox Jewish people. And then they would cycle through the years that they would leave it empty. But when you're taxed 75 to 85%, are you relying on that 3 out of 4 crops? Probably not, right? And so if the farmer noticed that something wasn't growing as well as it should, he would go to the epicenter where all 4 crops were connected, and he would plant mustard seeds. Because the mustard seed did not care about the boundary, the barrier, and anything like that. And it would like infiltrate the crops. And as it infiltrated the crops, it would bring nutrients to the soil that it actually needed. We tend to have sterilized versions of crops. Just look at your grass, right? And we tend to oh, look at how bright this green is, this grass is, and stuff like that. That's not natural. Does that make sense? When Jesus says the kingdom is like the mustard seed, it's this thing that's going to be invasive, it's not going to be tamed, and it's going to break through all the barriers. But at the same time, it's going to bring nutrients to the soil that are necessary. But it looks super small. Look at how small that picture is. That seed is, right? So when I went to Israel, I was like, I'm just going to buy some mustard seed. So I went to the marketplace to buy some mustard seed. And the guy I was with was like, you can't bring that into America, right? And I was like, why not? It's mustard seed. He's like, it'll ruin the American crop. And I was like, sweet, let's try it. But I didn't do it. So I'm like, what's going to happen, right? So, but I bought it, and then I had to leave it in Israel. I know, see? Right? It's the small little things, though, right? Now, here's the other part of this mustard seed. Everything the seed actually needs to unlock and find its potential is already in the seed. It just needs to get put in the soil to soak up the nutrients, to absorb it like 3 to 4 times the amount of water that it actually has. It needs to absorb it and have enough sunlight. And as that happens, guess what happens? It's not a painless process to go from a seed to a plant. There's stress, there's pressure, it starts building within there, and it actually starts tearing itself from the inside out. Right? It starts to transform and all that. We love the idea of like, oh, I'm going to have this nice little process. Nothing's going to be painful. And everything's just going to be stress-free. And the process of changing and transformation is actually kind of painful. And there's pressure that builds from within. And some of us, man, we have those pressures like, I'm good, and we back out. Now, the seed doesn't have the option, but you and I are humans, and so we have that option. And I would say you're 1 to 2 steps away from transformation, but some of us have backed out because the pressure got too much. And Jesus is like, no, I have something for you. I want you to experience life and life to the full. Is there going to be pressure within building? Yeah, that's going to be fine. Are you going to have to stop doing certain things and stop living in sin all the time? Yeah. Could you actually trust me a little bit more? Ooh, I don't know about that, Jesus. Right? That's where it gets a little pressure. Now, let's talk about the yeast thing. Jesus steps into the kitchen for this parable, and he starts talking about this parable and this small little thing. Now, yeast is this it's this weird thing that just kind of ferments, and it just kind of takes over the place. Now, if it's too much yeast, it actually will keep it from rising fully. If it's too little yeast, it won't rise at all either. But 60 pounds of flour gets transformed and literally changed because of this one little thing. And a little bit goes a long way, right? So here's point number 1. A little of God's power can do big, big things in our life. Jesus used this story of the yeast to teach the aspects of the kingdom of heaven. And if you read through the scriptures, yeast is usually used in a negative way. Like, avoid the teachings of the Pharisees because it's like yeast. But this one is, maybe yeast isn't bad. Maybe yeast is a good thing. Now, the mustard seed and the yeast, what's the point of them? They're supposed to change the environment that they're in. The mustard seed changes and transforms the soil that it's in to bring nutrients for the harvest and stuff like that. The yeast is to transform the flour, the batch of flour. The kingdom of heaven, the simply small little things, are supposed to change the environment that we're in. And you and I are like the yeast and the mustard seed. It seems small. It seems easily overlooked. Seems so easy just to not that big of a deal. But the reality of it is God takes simple, small acts of obedience and changes the environment that we find it in. Abram, acts of obedience. Hey, just follow me. I'm just going to lead you where to go. He goes on a 1,200-mile journey in the ancient world before maps and finds himself wandering around for years and years and years. And then God's like, oh yeah, here we are. All you have to do is follow God. Simple, right? Not that big of a deal, right? It doesn't seem that big of a deal. Our first youth ministry, I was a junior in college, and we lived in Marion, where I went to college, and Anderson, this church was hiring a youth pastor. And so I was like, fine, I'll go down and look at it and an interview. Basically, they had 3 kids, and they wanted me to babysit their kids. The problem is I'm not a great babysitter. So they had a gym, which had a full court basketball thing in it. They had a full kitchen and a van that this lady probably illegally drove like crazy in it. We've had way too many kids in this 15-passenger van than we probably should have. And all of a sudden, 3 kids grew to 15 kids, 15 kids grew to 30 kids, 30 kids grew to 50-plus kids. And it was Heather and 2 other ladies and I. And those other ladies were like, when it got too big and too noisy, they're like, we're out, see ya. So the times were like just Heather and I. One of my favorite things that we did is, I had this approach even back then that I'll ask for forgiveness, not permission. And we did an indoor paintball game, like inside this nice. And if you know church people, it's kind of funny because they have these this gym, and all of a sudden they're like, oh, you can't get it dirty, and please don't use the gym. And I kind of understand now paintball would be damaging, but whatever. But basically this small little thing, and we had a basketball. We started an after-school program because even back then I was like, people are still skeptical of church. You don't just have a church and people show up. You have to actually offer something that they want. And so we had an after-school program, so basketball, video games, we fed them, we kind of bust kids in and stuff like that. And it went from this nice little fun thing. We have basketball. We would talk maybe 5 minutes about kids and Jesus and making decisions and all that. To all of a sudden now they started asking questions, and it was like, oh, these are real questions. And this kid named Tyler, who lived in the neighborhood around the church, started asking some really deep questions quickly. And I was like, it kind of caught me off guard at first. I was like, oh, this is basketball level. And if you know me about basketball, I don't play basketball at all. But I played the most amount of basketball in this youth group because I was like, this is what the kids do. And so they all beat me because, look at me. You know what I mean? I'm not that big of a basketball. I'm not built for basketball. So even in this kid named Tyler, who's probably 7th grade or 8th grade at this time, he's 6 foot at the time, and he was just stand right over me and just toy with me, basically. But all of a sudden, in the middle of a game one time, it turned in from these kind of levels to sin. Why do I need God in my life? And I was like, oh, here we are. You know what I mean? And the weird thing about kids, you can answer the question, and they're like, well, what about this 3-point rule? And I'm like, whoa, now we're back here. So if you want to work with students, you have to actually have this flexibility of ADD, and it helps out and stuff like that to kind of function like that. But all of a sudden, Tyler was the first one who became a follower of Jesus in this youth group. And then this kid a girl named Desiree, and then her brother Jonathan, and then this kid we called Short Stack, and then all these all of a sudden we had 30 kids who became followers of Jesus, and then we baptized them and stuff like that. We discipled them, and Tyler, man, it just simply seemed like all we did was open a basketball, hey, you can play basketball. We didn't have a lot to offer. We had no budget. Anything we wanted to do, we had to raise our money or be and we were in college, by the way, so it was there's really nothing here. You know what I mean? We'll give you a safe place and you can ask questions. But then Tyler became a follower of Jesus, and then a decade later or so, I got to stand and watch him get married to his best friend, Alyssa. and just watch them just kind of like lead this beautiful moment. And then when we moved here to start our church, he was one of the very first people I called up. And I was like, hey, I just need people to pray for me. Would you consider that? And he's like, absolutely. So he's been a financial partner with Rethink Church. He's been a prayer partner for them. And it all started because I was like, we don't have a whole lot to offer, but here's a basketball and a court. And then you never know what's going to happen and stuff like that. And so it's almost like God likes to show off when you have nothing to offer. And he says, hey, there's this massive need. Can you do something with it? And you're like, well, what am I going to do? I'm here. You know what I mean? But once again, everything that you need is inside of you. He's planted something inside of you. The question is, will you go through the transformational process? Surrendering to the Holy Spirit, staying in step with the Holy Spirit, and becoming who he created you to be. Right? And going through that process. There's a time where Jesus was feeding, like he was teaching all these people. And you see this in John chapter 6 and Matthew chapter 14 and stuff like that. It's the same account, different perspectives of it. And he's feeding all these, he's teaching all these people. This massive crowd happens to gather around him. And we're going to show some plains. Like this is what we call the plains of Bethsaida. And this is the southern viewpoint of it. You see the Sea of Galilee. We go to the next one, Weston. We think this is where the feeding of the 5,000 took place. The plains of Bethsaida. And so I put the question mark in there because there's other speculative, like maybe it happened over here, right? And so it's getting near the Passover feast and stuff like that. And so the movement of Jesus is actually like at the highest moment and stuff like this. And there's 5,000 family units there, which means probably 20 to 25,000 humans, individual humans that are there. And so he asked Jesus, I love this about Jesus. He asked Philip, hey, we're going to buy all this bread to feed these people. Like he knew what he was going to do. And John says he was testing Philip. So let's pause really quickly about this. Does Jesus test us? Absolutely. Most of us don't like the idea of being tested by Jesus. All right? And we want Jesus just to accept us who we are, and he's just like, if we need to change, can you painlessly change me? Like, can we just become who you want me to become, right? I don't actually want to go through the process of giving up my sins, stop looking at porn, stop drinking too much, stop smoking, stop. And Jesus is like, no, I want you to actually go through the process. And when you go through that process, you feel all the feels you need to feel, and then all of a sudden you change. Maybe your issue isn't porn, maybe it's shopping too much. Maybe it's the doom scroll on Instagram, right? And you constantly just distract yourself. And Jesus is like, no, I actually want you to feel the feels, express why you're having all this distractive type feelings, and let's move through this, right? Jesus is going to test you. There are going to be moments. Now, how do you know what temptation is and what testing is, and is there a difference? Let's go to Jesus himself, okay? At one point, Jesus is in the early parts of his ministry, he's driven into the desert by the Holy Spirit, by the way. It's like there's like he's literally forcing him out into the desert. He's pushing him into the desert, right? And what's he do there? He's fasting of water and food for 40 days, and he's being tested by God. There's some kind of purification going on within there, like not necessarily sinful, but like just probably being in tune with the ministry of what God has in store for him, God the Father, right? And then Satan shows up, and he starts tempting. And if you read through the text here, you see what all the temptations are actually about Jesus' comfort. Oh, you're hungry? I bet you bread would actually be comforting for you, right? Why don't you just turn the stones into bread? And there's stones everywhere. So all you have to do is say it, right? He could do that. And usually, this testing is about something God has something for you on the other side. Tempting is, can you give in and give into your comfort? Is there something that you can get that's like, and you feel satisfied in that, right? It's a little comfort. And usually, that's where you're like, oh. And how comfortable are we in America? There's an entire book right here. I just read this last year. That we have death by comfort. It's an epidemic of comfort. How long do you sit in cold before you're like, oh, I'll just turn the heat up and not just be cold, right? Mine is air conditioning. If I'm hot, I'm like, turn on the air conditioning, don't care, right? So that's part of it. Now, let's go back to the event of the feeding 5,000. So Jesus looked at this and he's like, yep, the text says he's testing Philip in this. And Philip's like, dude, we could, like, a year's wages wouldn't even touch this for people to even have a bite. And then Andrew, Peter's brother, says, hey, there's this little boy. He's got a handful of loaves and he's got a handful of fish, right? Here's the kind of loaves and fish that you would eat in this place. There's a picture of the fish. Think about 3 or 4 like a handful of these kind of fish. Is that a lot of fish and a lot of meat right there? Not even a little bit, right? And the bread is like barley leaves or barley loaves, right? So like think about like day old discount stale bread that you bought for like 50 cents. That's the level of a barley loaf. Barley loaf is the lowest of the grain type harvest. There's nothing significant about it. It's not tasting well. It's just kind of there because you need some nutrition, right? And so Jesus is like, hey, this is what I have. And we don't know how it actually ended up, but Jesus takes it, he breaks it, he starts blessing God for it, and he starts handing it out, and everyone gets enough to eat so that there's basketfuls left over. Does that make sense? And now all of a sudden it's like, okay, now we do this. Now, the disciples that go around, they pick up the 12 baskets, and they do this. And it's this thing that just is amazing to me that's how this works. Outside in this desolate place, there's no other options, and all of a sudden now everyone has this filling. All because this little boy was like, hey, I've got what I have. It's not much. But in your hands, Jesus, who knows? Right? It may actually go well with this. Now, number 2, the kingdom of power makes all the difference in our lives, right? God has a habit of taking these small, little acts of obedience and doing great things with them. And so God has a lot of things to do with us. And the beautiful thing about this is that there's this trusting aspect of it. When we have a lack of generosity in our life, it's not a financial issue, it's actually a lack of trust issue. Can we actually trust Jesus with our generosity? I was reading a book this summer, Holy Sweat, and it's talking about a dad and a son who was walking around, like they were exploring the cliffs and stuff like this. And the dad was like kind of overlooking the foothills that he was just kind of climbed up. And all of a sudden he hears this, hey, Dad, catch me. And he looks up and his son had just jumped off a cliff right at him. And he like catches, and all the dads are like, what? So he catches him as like this acrobatic circus act type catch. And then like a couple minutes later, he's like, dude, why did you do this? And the son goes, you're my dad. I knew you'd catch me. Right? Could we live our life following Jesus like that? Carefree. Do we live our life with generosity when it's like that? When Jesus is like, hey, why don't you provide a meal for them? Hey, that person on the side of the road asking for $5, what if you just gave it to them? Don't worry about what they're going to do with it. And here's why. Jesus gives us money all the time. And what do we do with it? Who's judging how you spend your money? And if we truly have an understanding of stewardship, that means that God owns everything. We just simply steward it. And are we stewarding it in the way that God is a God-honoring way? It's so easy to look at the people on the side of the road and be like, oh, they're just going to use it for alcohol. Great. What are you using your money for? Right? So we don't have to get into that too much, but there's that one, right? So there's part of this process that we actually need to work through. And just like taking a simple, small box lunch, basically, saying, Jesus, here you go. Can you feed thousands of people with it? Yeah. Maybe, right? So when we talk about a biblical tithe, this is your money point. Just brace yourself, okay? We talk about the biblical tithe. We're talking about a 10%, where we return what God has given us at 10%. That's all he's asking for in the scriptures. You see it in Abraham and Melchizedek. You see it all the way through the scriptures. That's the baseline biblical tithe. So part of us, we actually had to know how much do you actually make and what would be 10% of it. Some of us are so distant from our money because we spend so much of it on a debit card, automatic transactions, that there's no feeling to it. right? Like the pain sensors, like if you pay with cash, they've done these studies over and over again. You pay with cash, the pain sensors of your brain actually activate. When you do check, there's less. When you do a debit card, there's hardly any of it. When you do Apple Cash, it doesn't even register on your brain activity. Give me all your cash. I'm just kidding. Like, so some of us, we don't even know what 10% of our paycheck would be because we're so distant. It's such this weird foreign thing out there. The thought of actually knowing how much is 10% of your paycheck could be a major first step. Right? And the other part of this is it's not a financial issue for most of us. It's actually a trust issue. Right? Could you actually jump off a cliff and yell, "Hey, Dad, catch me"? Could you live that carefree? Or would you be like, nope, let me bring up the safety harness and then jump? And Jesus is like, not so much, right? Well, let's work through this. Would 10% actually wreck your life, financially speaking? 10% may be overwhelming when it comes to the trust, though. Because it's not a financial issue for most of us. It's actually more of a trust issue. Could you actually catch me, Jesus? Maybe 10% would be so overwhelming it would actually cripple you. So here's my challenge. What if you did 2%? Let's do 2% for 3 months, 2 months, somewhere in there. Could you trust him that much? And then could you go to 4%? Can you trust him that much? And then eventually you get to the 8%, the 10%. But here's the challenge. There's Christians who live on a reverse tithe. They give away 90% to kingdom fund, like kingdom ministries, and they live off of 10%. Rethink Church would not exist without people like that. They're wealthier people in parts of this world who are like, yeah, let me just give you this money. Like we believe in the kingdom mission. We believe in what Heather and Marc are really going to step out and do, and we're going to fund it, right? So there's 225,000 plus people in Lake County alone who have no religious affiliation, no relationship with Jesus. It's going to require generosity from people like you and I to step in and say, hey, could we actually see you come into a relationship with Jesus? If they happen to step into this building, great. If they don't, even great. You know what I mean? Like, it's not about this church building being filled. It's about the kingdom of heaven being like advanced and people's lives changing. And it doesn't happen because we're stingy. It happens when we become generous. And it seems so easy to be like, oh, there's nothing I can, like, what's my 1%? What's my 2%? What's my 10% really going to do? What's my act of obedience really going to do? But yet God takes small, simple acts of obedience and multiplies them in great ways. And it's so easy to think that it's not that big of a deal. But it is, right? Let me just end with this, that Paul writes this in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. He says this, therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Are you laboring in the Lord, and are you knowing that it's not in vain? Never give up. Never look back and say, well, I can't do this grand gesture of a thing. And Jesus said, no, I just want you to have this simple act of obedience. And what would it look like to trust me with this simple act of obedience? Right? And there's treasure here. There's treasure in the acts of obedience. And some of us approach messages like this and act like Jesus is a treasure map. That if I do this and then I get wealthy and I'll do this, and that's not the case. See Jesus as the treasure. That following Jesus is actually the treasure itself. Because you could do nothing to have your salvation. So why not just simply have a response and say, okay, how can I actually do this? How can I respond to your gracious gift so much? And see him as the treasure, not the treasure map. Let's pray, and then we're going to go into communion. Jesus, thanks for this day. Thanks for who you are. Jesus, in every single one of us, there's a space in our lives that we don't trust you enough. My prayer this week is that we would learn to trust you more. And not only trust you more, that we would actually put into action. And as we trust you more, Jesus, that we would step into a simple, small act of obedience, whatever that first one is. And as we do that, God, we're just going to offer what we have, and we're going to watch you do amazing things. So, Jesus, would you accept our gifts, our offerings to you? And would you multiply that to reach the needs of this community? The 225,000 plus people who have no religious affiliation at all. God, would they come into a relationship with you because of our acts of generosity and our acts of obedience? Maybe it's a simple invitation. Maybe it's a simple prayer. Maybe it's simply just showing up with what we have and offering it to them to try to add value to their life. Maybe it's an actual gift, financial gift, God. But God, we're going to offer what we have to you. And we're going to watch you do amazing things with it. And God, help us to really, truly trust you. That you'll catch us no matter what. We love you, Jesus. In your name we pray this. Amen.